evening, and I'll share just a little bit more about our presenter for this evening in just a moment. Before I do that, let me give you a couple of quick updates. I want to go ahead and announce at Easter 2021 here at Journey Church will be outside worship, Easter service 2021 here at Journey Church, outside worship at Doco Meadows Park, 11 a.m. That's in Blythewood, South Carolina. Blythewood, South Carolina, Doco Meadows Park. If you remember, we had our first service of the year there in Blythewood, not far away from where we're currently located. And that service will be at 11 a.m. outside worship. Please spread the news, share the news. We're praying that the Lord holds off the rain. You know, we always have these great plans to go outside, but we're praying that God holds off the rain. And as long as the Lord hears our prayer, we will be there, and we expect to see you. We're praying that we see you again. Easter Sunday, first Sunday in April is Easter, first Sunday in April, and we will be worshiping outside. We had such a great time last time. The team was so encouraged and heard your responses of wanting to return to being there. So we're looking forward. Lottie-dottie, everybody, we'll be looking for you Easter Sunday outside Doco Meadows Park, Blythewood, South Carolina, 11 a.m. The second update, this coming Sunday, drive-through communion here at Journey Church. Drive-through communion, our lay shepherds, myself, our pastors, we will look forward to serving you in your car. We ask that, as always, you wear your mask and that you would please come and receive the body and receive the blood of Christ as we celebrate the beginning of this month here at Journey Church. Journey, we appreciate all that you do in every way to support the ministries here. Know that we are praying for you. Our intercessory prayer team and prayer ministry goes in, and that's for everybody. Remember, intercessory prayer is for everyone. You don't have to pray to be on that call to join in. Just come and be prayed over. Come and be in the atmosphere of prayer to have your soul lifted up. So those are the updates that I have for you. Now, let's get ready for Bible study. Our presenter this evening, Dr. Harry Singleton. He was with us in the month of January for our Martin Luther King Day celebration here at Journey Church. And he's back this evening to share with us about race and Christianity. Race and Christianity. We just finished Black History Month. But 28 days is not long enough to share and to celebrate and to educate, to liberate our minds. Remember our theme last month? You must learn. So we've asked Dr. Singleton to come back and let's continue to engage around race and Christianity and how our faith intertwines and how our faith is lifted up and helps to liberate us. Remember Frederick Douglass, as a slave, wanted to know this. He asked this question: how can you beat me Monday through Saturday, all during the week, and then preach to me about Jesus Christ, who loves all of his children and wants everyone to be free? He had a problem. He had a problem with that. And I think there's still a problem that exists within our community of saying we love a God whom we've never seen, but yet we can't share that same love for our brothers and sisters all around us that we may see every day. Dr. Harry Singleton, he is African-American studies professor at the University of South Carolina. He is a personal friend. We were talking this past week and just found out, remembered, we were in seminary together. Yes, I was there along with with him. I was in seminary. We were in some of the same classes. We just had a great time laughing and sharing old professors and other students that were there. So this makes me doubly excited to have him. He is a product of the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia. So he will come and present, and we're going to have more discussion this entire month about race and Christianity. How do we live out our faith each and every day, knowing all the things that we work against and know that also God loves us. So I'm going to do it the traditional way here at Journey. I'm going to ask the praise team to come on in and sing the preacher up, and then we're going to bring him to you. Please interact, please engage, enter your messages, your notes, questions in the chat box, in the messages there, and we'll be glad to respond. Once again, welcome, happy week to you, and we look forward to sharing with you later.
There's a leak in this old building, and my soul has got to move. My soul, my soul. There's a leak in this old building, and my soul has got to move. I got another building I made by building keeps on leaking.
to God. It is good and indeed a delight to be back at Journey once again to talk with you on the subject of race, racism, and Christianity. I have been asked, as always, by Martin Quick, my point man, as always, and I'm always grateful and appreciative to him for the opportunity to share with you on this topic that is still very crucial and very relevant in our time. Racism has not been expunged from American and global life. It continues to haunt communities of color throughout the world. Of course, here in America as well, no less. And it continues to circumscribe the achievement of black aspiration. None more so for me as a theologian has this been the case than with the European and the United States of America's religious institutions, and more particularly their Christian institutions. In talking about race, racism, and Christianity, as I will take most of my talking points for this session from my second work, White Religion and Black Humanity, the first chapter of it on the question of black humanity. When we began to look at the impact that Christian faith has had on the perpetuation of racism, particularly in this country, we must first acknowledge the process of black dehumanization itself, unfortunately, that began in Africa with the European man's dehumanizing take on African culture when he went down south to Africa, so to speak, and saw Africans in their cultural expressions that he immediately branded wayward and backwards. And so when the decision was made to enslave West Africans to increase European economic expansion and general wealth, a sinister process began to make it seem as though the enslavement of the African was justified not only on human grounds, but on theological grounds as well, as we talk about Christianity and race today. When we look at that debasement, it happened in 3 stages. The first stage, begun by Spanish and Portuguese explorers, was to categorize African culture as heathen. In so doing, an oppressive category was created that made African culture synonymous with a lack of civilization. This would be crucial. If it could be established that Africans were engaged in cultural expressions that were uncivilized, it would provide the social justification necessary for destroying African culture for the purpose of indoctrinating the African to European norms for living. Yet the nature of this process of black dehumanization would continue to reveal itself as time progressed. For what would be a so-called basis of civilizing the heathen African would come to show itself not as a process of true benevolence that would eventually acknowledge the equal humanity of blacks, but one that would bring to light the true contempt not only for African culture by whites, but for African people themselves. As is well documented, the historical rationale for the treatment of Africans is to expose them to civilization and thereby make them truly human. History has shown us that the primary intent of the slaveholding community was to dupe the African with clever sophistry or skilled reasoning about her inferior capacities in the effort to sell African enslavement as a legitimate, eternal phenomenon. Such skilled lines of reasoning, however, never found a solid footing in the eyes of many Africans, not because they were heathen and unable to fathom the greater good of their treatment, but because of the constant mockery of African culture by whites and the seeming contempt inherent in whites' reflection on African culture. In short, a cursory examination of the process of black dehumanization establishes clearly that the intent was not to humanize Africans at all, but to desecrate African culture. In so doing, it was hoped that such an approach would separate Africans from any historical roots and make them better pawns for eternal servitude to whites in the colonies and America. The second stage of black dehumanization moved from making the African a heathen to now calling the African a savage. While heathenism sought to maintain that a group of humans is uncivilized, savagery sought to establish that a group is incapable of being civilized. This process would begin in the colonies in the mid to late 17th century, shortly into the Slavocracy. In this stage, the African was taught that although incapable of civilization on the level of that of whites, her proximity to superior cultured whites in a posture of eternal servitude could provide her with some modicum of civilization. This would be the best that the African could hope for, given her defective human nature and shorn of inequalities culturally and aesthetically that would make her authentically human. It is on this basis, one of African savagery, that slaveholders would begin to instruct slaves that slavery is the best possible relationship that could exist between the two races. More important, it was hoped that the slave would see the hard work expended by the planters in both the deportation process and the building of plantations in order to establish slavery as an extraordinarily benevolent gesture by which the slave should be extremely grateful. In so doing, it further reaffirmed the ideological nature of black dehumanization by giving white racism a positive public presentation under the guise of moral uprightness. It was thus in tandem with the concept of slavery as a positive good that the doctrine of permanent black inferiority began its career as a rationale first for slavery itself and later for post-emancipation forms of racial oppression, or those forms of racial oppression that emerged after slavery. Thus, what began as a process of government-sanctioned black dehumanization reached full maturity by the early 19th century. That maturity was made all the more formidable by the numerous literary tracts and oratorical pronouncements by well-respected white leaders in every discipline, most notably its religious leaders, making the case for black people's natural inferiority. In such a fundamentally racist cultural milieu, black inferiority became firmly established as the intellectual norm for white thinking about African people. In particular, whites would come to characterize the dark skin of the African as nature's preferred method of informing both Europeans and Africans that black skin was a sign of a demonic being. And this represents the third stage of the process of black dehumanization, from heathenism to savagery, and now to stage 3, black skin representing the demonic. This stage serves as the bridge in the sense that the significance of the designation of the demonic to the African would lay the foundation for a smooth transition for white intellectuals from secular rationales for black dehumanization to theological rationales for black dehumanization. In this regard, what was at stake was not just the color of skin of African people, but its origins as well. Hence, the branding of the African as demonic was not to be understood as an aesthetic assault on her humanity, but rather as a respectable hypothesis regarding the nature of black humanity. In particular, what was at stake here for Europeans eager to normalize African enslavement was to treat the demonic in such a way that Africans' dark skin was but a visible manifestation of black people's totally inward corruption. An inward corruption that extended beyond the biblical fall to which all human beings fell prey and in which all Christians are subject. In fact, it was the dark skin of the African that demystified for Europeans why the African was so far afield in her cultural expressions. The radically different skin hue between Europeans and Africans was nature's way, as it was preached, of revealing to Europeans the radically different and therefore total corruption of African people. By categorizing black skin as an outward manifestation of the African's natural corruption, by inference, then, it made white skin the polar opposite of that of Africans directly associated with the divine or with God. It also, by inference, made whiteness in all of its cultural, intellectual, and aesthetic dimensions naturally superior, the highest breed of humanity on earth. Finally, it also meant that God had created the first and best humans as white, with all other races of people representing a hierarchical descent and moral degeneration, a falling off, if you would, from the purity that whiteness represented. It is in this spirit that white intellectuals in particular consider whiteness to be the color of the original humans, God's first and therefore superior creation. This would become particularly significant in 19th century racial anthropology, where leading white scholars categorized races in a hierarchical scheme on the basis of both the order of creation and, not surprisingly, moral attributes. It was conveniently argued, of course, that whites were the original racial creation of humans by God, and in being so imbued whites with superior moral, intellectual, and aesthetic qualities. All other races were then possessed of diminished moral and intellectual capacities, as it corresponded with their particular rankings. Needless to say, African peoples occupied the lowest rung of that racial hierarchy, behind, of course, yellow and red peoples, leading some white anthropologists to conclude that blacks' aesthetic presentation and intellectual capacities were more on the level of an ape or an orangutan than that of humans. Thus, it was through the seminal use of the category of the demonic as black skin that black humanity, as polar opposite to that of whiteness, stood very little chance of being considered human aesthetically and or with reference to human nature. This categorization would be of enormous benefit for the white Christian community, as I come closer to my subject, in both the colonies and America, for the religious sanctioning of the process of black dehumanization. More to the point, it is the categorization of black skin as the demonic that the white Christian community would use as its theological starting point regarding its eternal commitment to black dehumanization. Having established that black skin is a sign of the demonic, white clergymen and theologians, particularly in the early to mid-18th century, had come upon a line of reasoning that would satisfy two important conditions for the use of religion as a means of social control of the slaves and giving divine approval to the institutions of slavery itself. The first of those two concerns was the obligation many white Christians felt toward the conversion of heathen Africans. The basis of this obligation stemmed from both white Protestant and Catholic contentions that the African had no religion and was therefore lost in a wilderness of spiritual darkness. Enlightenment, as they saw it, came only through Jesus Christ's message of universal salvation, made possible through the grace granted Jesus by God. Even early in the observation process of Africans in their native land, whites had already drawn some abhorrent conclusions concerning African culture and fed their Christian consciousness on the one hand and their slaveholding conscience on the other hand. Yet the fact of the matter is that Africans were people of profound religious faith in their pre-colonial existence. In West Africa in particular, African people were given over primarily to Islam, syncretized with indigenous religions, and Christianity practiced intermittently. But it was not Christianity exclusively. And for English and Portuguese planters, that difference was not only glaring, but was seen as principally responsible for Africans' contentment with their heathenism. More important was the fact that this difference in faith expression confirmed for white explorers not only the heathenism that accompanied the Africans' small exposure to Christianity, but also Africans' innate incapacity to build civilization. The second concern for white explorers and later white slaveholders was the edifying impact that conversion usually had on a human being. That is to say, to what extent could white planters eternally perpetuate slavery with slaves who would become Christians? To what ends could planters continue to socially control slaves through the institutional teaching of the slave's inferiority and at the same time expose the slaves to the freedom in Christ that the Apostle Paul speaks of in New Testament literature? Would it not be reasonable to conclude that even in Africans' innate inferiority, the slave would deduce that the freedom of which Paul speaks was meant to be a contemporary revelation that Jesus would want Africans to be free from slavery? On these questions, a couple of points have significance. The first of those has to do with the Africans' capacity for civilization and religious instruction. As stated a few minutes ago, much of late 17th and 18th century anthropological literature written by white intellectuals sought to establish that the African had the lowest capacity for sustained intellectual performance, that the African's intellectual capacity was closer to apes and orangutans than humans, was a widely held hypothesis by white scholars of the period. Moreover, the fact that many white anthropologists added to this discussion the notion that Africans, in their barbarism, even mated with apes and orangutans, fortified all the more that Africans lacked the capacity to live as human beings. While it could be argued that such conclusions concerning the humanity of black people was a sincere attempt on the part of whites to deal with the difference that African culture presented aesthetically and culturally, the fact of the matter is that the different anthropological leanings had to be established by whites as a necessary corollary to black oppression. Group difference, in other words, is required in order to set oneself apart from the enslaved group. And Europeans highlighted the full arsenal of differences between them and Africans to sell slavery to themselves and the world. This understanding of the African as irrevocably corrupt would also influence major clergymen in the slavocracy. In fact, most clergy owned slaves and were convinced of the divine nature of slavery. A leading slave proponent, Cotton Mather, in his work The Negro Christianized, reflected the sentiment of the period when he observed that indeed their stupidity is a discouragement, it may seem unto as little purpose to teach as to wash an Ethiopian. For Mather and other prominent ministers, no matter how steep the challenge was to convert slaves who seemingly had no desire or capacity to do so, Christian obligation demanded it in principle and in mission. Yet for many white ministers, what Africans lacked in anthropological capacity to be converted, God would conveniently provide to them in spiritual capacity. The second point regarding slave conversion is the implication being that it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain that Africans need to be converted and at the same time argue that they were irrevocably barbarous. Regardless of how persuasive the argument that African savagery could be overcome through God's grace, slaveholders were increasingly of the belief that the attempt to convert Africans to Christianity at least implied the natural ability to be converted, and in so doing implied that the African was capable of civilization on a level at or near the same level as that of whites. If this conclusion regarding black humanity were to become internalized as normative thinking, then it could have signaled the death knell for slavery, given that its legitimacy had been predicated on an eternally depraved or corrupt African human being. Moreover, slaveholders were particularly cognizant of the inconsistencies that could and did emerge between Christian conversion and the numerous biblical references to freedom. As such, slaveholders were aggressively looking for ways to stem the freedom tide, so to speak, that is implied in Christian conversion. Thoughts of increased rebellions and insurrections by converted slaves who had a divine right to refuse bondage in their thinking haunted many a slaveholder, not only where his immediate economic prosperity was concerned, but the economic prosperity of future generations of whites as well. This would bring slaveholders into direct conflict with white clergy, theologians, and laypersons, in which the clergy would remain firm on the Christian obligation to convert slaves. Thus, the white community was now facing one of its most substantive early theological challenges. But whatever might be said about the impasse between white planters and clergy, it was clear that they were universally agreed that slavery had to continue, but were also universally agreed that the revelation of God in Jesus Christ speaks of freedom for the Christian. What was needed then in their thinking was a treatment of Christian freedom, the leadership of the white mainline denominations that would make the case for slavery's eternal existence, and at the same time render a type of freedom to slaves. Put another way, what was needed was a treatment of Christian freedom that denied institutional freedom to slaves, that denied societal freedom to slaves, but granted them some form of freedom in Christ. Such a treatment would be constructed in the first quarter of the 18th century, and one I still consider one of the most significant and damaging impacts on black advancement and slavery up to today. In a letter written in 1727 by the Bishop of London, the Anglican Bishop of London, Lord Berkeley, and addressed to the masters and mistresses of families in the English plantations abroad, meaning America, exhorting them to encourage and promote the instruction of their Negroes in the Christian faith. Lord Berkeley thought that he had constructed a treatment of Christian freedom that would break the impasse between slaveholders and the white Christian community. and in many ways it did. More important, he thought that he had found a treatment of freedom that would allay the highest fears of slaveholders, and that is that the conversion of the slave required their immediate freedom. This excerpt from the letter from Bishop Berkeley speaks to that theological dilemma. Christianity and the embracing of the gospel does not make the least alteration in civil property or in any duties which belong to civil relations. But in all these respects, it continues persons just in the same state as it found them. The freedom which Christianity gives is a freedom from the bondage of sin and Satan, and from the dominion of men's and women's lusts and passions and inordinate desires. But as to their outward condition, meaning their societal condition, whatever that was before, whether bond or free, their being baptized and becoming Christians makes no manner of change in their condition. To be sure, Berkeley styled this treatment of freedom as the central meaning of Paul's theology. Berkeley saw this as the biblical imperative for Paul in his first letter to the church at Corinth, where he admonished the faithful, "Let every man or human abide in the same calling wherein he or she was called. Let every man or woman wherein he is called or she is called, therein abide with God." Those of you familiar with that passage recognize it as 1 Corinthians 7:20 and 24. Berkeley found in these passages not only what he thought to be a substantive biblical foundation for the eternal maintenance of divine institutions, but also a substantive theological point of departure for establishing slavery as a contemporary manifestation of such a divine institution. Insofar as Paul makes a provision for both the past and present by using was in verse 20 and is in verse 24, he was interpreted by Bishop Berkeley as making the calling of humans in their present state not only God's plan for humanity in biblical history, but in all future contexts as well. This meant for Bishop Berkeley that we now had more than a convenient interpretation in not changing the outward or societal condition of the slave, but we now had a biblical mandate to not allow such freedom as well. But more important, Berkeley had constructed a treatment of freedom that not only perpetuated slavery under the guise of Christendom and the guidance of Christendom, but would also establish a theological paradigm that would come to set the tone of Christian theology in the colonies and even after the Revolution, the United States of America. By conceiving of the task of Christian faith as one that calls for transformation of the religious individual in only those terms, Berkeley was establishing critical objectives for the cause of white supremacy on a few significant fronts. First, he was for the most part able to allay slaveholders' fears of the biblical implications of Christian freedom, meaning a change in the outward or societal condition of slaves, thus preserving white privilege throughout eternity. Second, he reaffirmed the merits of conversion of the slaves to white Christians and reassured them that this duty-bound mission is pleasing to God, that this was the only type of freedom the slaves could experience. The third critical objective accomplished by Bishop Berkeley through this treatment of Christian freedom is that it went a long way in creating in the mind of the slave an existential dilemma between the seemingly natural desire for societal freedom on the one hand, but an adherence to the divine mandate of being content with only inward freedom as taught by white clergy on the other hand. More important, Bishop Berkeley's treatment of Christian freedom served as an infusion of new life into a white community and affirmed for many white Christians that because God had given them the divine imperative to convert heathen Africans to Christian faith, it served as a divine confirmation of the intellectual and spiritual superiority of white human beings. Pragmatically, this treatment of freedom by Bishop Berkeley would give divine sanction to slavery and subsequently to the establishment of many slave codes that gave slaveholders unbridled power to use whatever means available to keep slaves on the plantation. It gave white planters carte blanche, or full discretionary power, to use any manner of psychological ploys, branding, public whippings, auctions, feet of recaptured slaves severed, removal of tendons from ankles with no anesthesia, etc., to instill in the slaves an acute sense of fear in the name of God and country, a fear that would come to be explained as a microcosm of the fear the slave should have for the wrath of God, for violation of divine will, i.e., for leaving the plantation, or worse yet, engaging in insurrections to try to topple the institution of slavery. That is to say, the fear of God, a recurring biblical theme, would be used by slaveholders as a means of social control and to eternalize in the minds of both slaves and slaveholders the divine nature of slavery. But more succinctly, this new inward fear, freedom of God interrelationship was used to continually impress upon the slave that rebellion against the institution was tantamount to rebellion against God's ordinance, and that eternal damnation was the non-negotiable price to pay. Hence, the ultimate goal of white clergy was to establish as the theological norm for the slave the violation of slave law as a violation of God's law. As this approach to faith became more and more codified in the religious life of the colonies in early America, and as an Orthodox Christianity began to emerge more distinctly, a substantive Christian faith emerged that would have a devastating and lasting effect on the way faith would come to be envisioned in American life. Specifically, Christian faith would come to divinize black dehumanization and white privilege by denying societal freedom to the slaves on theological grounds. But more important, over generations of this understanding of Christian faith and its institutionalization in the life of the early church, an inferior-superior racial relationship would come to be so normal, so common, and so proper that its naturalness seemed evident. It is in this regard that as we move through the Slavocracy, we see even some of our most celebrated leaders lamenting the fact that many blacks had become seduced by this theology, by justifying slavery on religious grounds and by making the question of the moral and ethical demands of living of faith a fearful proposition. It led the person of faith to fearfully presume that the theretofore black-white relationship was indeed an extension of the very mind of God, and therefore as natural as the revolutions and orbits of the planets themselves. In short, the justification of slavery on religious grounds blurred the distinction between a material world created by God and a socio-historical world created by whites. In so doing, God came to be seen as the creator of both worlds. So pernicious was this impact on the slave community. Its effect on the social conscience of many a slave is what caused Harriet Tubman to lament toward the end of her life that I could have freed many more slaves on the Underground Railroad. Problem was that they didn't know they were slaves. It is in this regard that Bishop Berkeley's treatment of Christian freedom has profound post-slavery implications. Although history has shown us that Bishop Berkeley's treatment of Christian freedom could only stand the test of immediate time, its theological impact in terms of understanding of faith, I contend, has outlived slavery. In its short-term application, the inward freedom interpretation revealed its major weakness insofar as slaveholders' fears that conversion of the slaves did eventually come to mean physical freedom from slavery were realized. It also revealed its weakness in the sense that conversion to Christianity for the slave meant at the least a tacit concession by white Christian missionaries that blacks were now in some way human, and therefore difficult to make the case that they remained slaves. The large amounts of anti-slavery literature in the beginning of the 19th century and up to the Civil War revolved principally around these two weaknesses. Yet, American history has also shown us that the process of black dehumanization was far from over. As quiet as the secret is kept, slavery was graciously kind to whites. It allowed whites to procure untold wealth on the backs of free slave labor, of which we've yet to be compensated, and to build successful institutions in practically every arena of human existence. But more important, it allowed whites to perpetually bask in the bright rays of their racial superiority through its systemic denial of black entry into those institutions as their equals. Thus, despite the fact that the Slavocracy had ended institutionally, whites were not about to abandon a paradigm for successful living, even if it meant an ideological tweaking of slave teaching. Whites knew also that a successful paradigm for living had of necessity to include a consistent assault on the incapacity of blacks to live as free men and women. Moreover, whites also realized that they certainly could not entertain any notions of black equality in the forwarding of a post-slavery interpretation of racial oppression, and were willing again to employ its most learned scholars, including its theologians and clergy, to legitimate that interpretation. Many white theologians and clergy in the post-slavery context committed themselves to a reworking of Bishop Berkeley's inward freedom hermeneutic or interpretation. What we would witness is an approach to Christian faith that reaffirmed white superiority and black inferiority through a system of racial separation in all public arenas of American life, and the white religious establishment's ordaining of it all by God. In particular, this updated racist interpretation granted black people inward freedom from individual sin, but not outward freedom still from white control of the dispensation of social, economic, and political justice in American life, and more important, white control of the aesthetic mediums that would influence both black and white self-images. The legitimation of this post-slavery reality would be most stringently promulgated in theological tracts of white theologians and in sermons of white clergy through their tireless efforts in segregation, and even now in a so-called post-racial society, they were able to establish as the norm in Christian life in America an approach to faith that was acutely anti-revolutionary, anti-black, profoundly individualistic, and beyond the affirmation of God's favor on white aesthetic, cultural, and intellectual superiority, decidedly otherworldly. Trying now to decenter this otherworldly worldview and focus on the divine right to freedom in this world continues to be the chief theological challenge of the contemporary church as well. Race and Christianity continue to be in dreadful relationship with each other. Thank you for listening. May peace and power forever be yours, and may God bless.